A relentless woman risks everything to dismantle a powerful criminal network. But just as victory seems within reach, she uncovers a betrayal so deep it could destroy her fight for justice. The tires of Clara Montenegro's car crunched against the gravel road, the surrounding landscape stretching into an expanse of emptiness. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel as the rhythmic hum of the engine became her sole companion on the isolated highway. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving only a faint glow in the sky and the stark beam of her headlights cutting through the darkness. Clara had driven this road many times before, but tonight felt different. The unease was subtle at first, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, but it grew louder as the minutes ticked by. She had been investigating a high-profile disappearance, covertly digging into areas where her formal title as judge couldn't reach. The stakes were high, and the risks even higher, but Clara had always trusted her instincts. Until now. A flicker of movement on the road ahead pulled her from her thoughts. At first, it was barely perceptible, like a shadow shifting where no shadow should exist. Then, as her car drew closer, the silhouette of a vehicle emerged, parked haphazardly across the road. Her pulse quickened. A black van, unmarked, its doors shut tight. The headlights of her car reflected off its surface, giving it an almost predatory gleam. Clara slowed, her foot easing off the accelerator. She scanned her surroundings, her sharp eyes catching the subtle glint of metal in the bushes on either side of the road. Guns. Her chest tightened, but her expression remained composed, a skill honed from years in courtrooms, facing dangerous individuals. She reached for her phone, but the absence of signal bars on the screen sent a cold wave of dread through her. The figures stepped into the light one by one, 4 men, faces partially obscured by scarves and caps. Each held a weapon, their postures confident, almost casual. Clara forced herself to breathe steadily, assessing the situation. She considered reversing, but a quick glance in her rearview mirror revealed another vehicle pulling up behind her, trapped. One of the men approached, his movements deliberate, almost rehearsed. He gestured for her to lower the window. Clara complied, her face calm and unflinching, though her mind raced with contingency plans. "Step out of the car, ma'am," the man ordered, his voice low and gravelly. Clara didn't move immediately. Instead, she studied him, the roughness of his hands, the faint scar slicing through his left eyebrow, the slight limp in his stride. Details. Every detail mattered. "I'm just passing through," she said evenly, her voice betraying none of the fear curling in her stomach. The man didn't respond. Instead, he opened her door and gestured again, his impatience growing. She stepped out, the cool night air brushing against her skin as 2 of the other men flanked her. One of them searched her, efficiently but without hesitation, and confiscated her phone, her bag, and a small notebook she always carried. "Take her," the leader barked. The word struck like a hammer, final and absolute. Clara's wrists were bound with coarse rope, her movements restricted as they guided her toward the black van. Her mind worked furiously, cataloging every action, every sound, the faint creak of the van door as it slid open, the stale smell of gasoline and cigarette smoke inside, the clink of a chain rattling nearby. Once inside, Clara was seated and blindfolded. The darkness felt suffocating, but she knew it was her mind's reaction to the loss of sight. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself. Her heartbeat slowed as she focused on the details she could still perceive. The hum of the van's engine, the slight dip in the road suggesting a turn, the texture of the blindfold against her skin. It wasn't cloth, but some sort of synthetic material. Every fragment of information became a puzzle piece for later use. The journey felt endless, each second stretching like an eternity. Occasionally, the men exchanged words, their tones sharp but muffled. Clara strained to listen, picking up fragments of conversation. "Boss wants her alive. Just follow the plan." The van came to an abrupt stop, jerking her forward. Hands gripped her arms, pulling her out and guiding her across uneven ground. Gravel gave way to what felt like dirt, then a solid floor as they entered some kind of structure. The air grew colder, carrying a damp metallic scent. A door creaked shut behind her, sealing her in. Finally, the blindfold was removed. Clara blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room was sparse, metal walls, a wooden chair bolted to the floor in the center, and a camera perched ominously in one corner. Her captors stood silently, their eyes fixed on her. Clara's gaze swept the room, absorbing every inch. She forced herself to remain composed, even as her thoughts raced. Fear could not take root, not yet. Whatever game they were playing, she would be ready. The cold air inside the abandoned warehouse clung to Clara's skin as she was pushed forward, her wrists still bound tightly with a coarse rope. The building, an imposing shell of rusted metal and shattered windows, echoed with every step the men took. Their shadows flickered in the dim light of a single swaying bulb, giving the scene an almost surreal quality. Miguel Prado stood at the far end of the space, his figure framed by a desk littered with papers, maps, and a handgun placed carelessly on the edge. A man who carried authority with a quiet, dangerous presence. He didn't so much as flinch when Clara was dragged before him. His dark eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned her from head to toe with the precision of someone used to sizing up threats. "This is her?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. One of the captors, a burly man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, nodded. "She's the one. Found her near the docks. Might have seen something she shouldn't have." Clara kept her face blank, fighting the tremor threatening to betray her fear. She had heard the name Miguel Prado whispered in conversations that people didn't want to have. She knew enough to recognize that the man before her was dangerous, not just because of his power, but because of his unpredictability. Miguel tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle. "You don't look like much," he said, the hint of a smirk playing at his lips. "What were you doing near the docks?" Clara hesitated for just a moment, just enough to seem nervous, not suspicious. I was looking for my brother," she stammered, deliberately keeping her voice shaky. "He hasn't been home in weeks. I thought he might be working there." The lie came easily, though her heart hammered in her chest. It was simple, believable. She had to play the part of an ordinary woman who had stumbled into something far beyond her comprehension. Miguel's smirk widened slightly as if amused by her response. He leaned back against the desk, his posture relaxed but his gaze unrelenting. "What do you think?" he asked, glancing at the scarred man. "She's scared," the man replied with a shrug. "Doesn't seem like she's lying." For now, they believed her. Clara allowed herself a small exhale, but her mind was racing. She needed to learn more about this place, these men, and why they had taken her. Pretending to be insignificant gave her a chance to observe, to understand her captors without drawing suspicion. Miguel turned away, picking up the gun and spinning it absently in his hand. "Keep her here," he said, his tone dismissive. "If she knows anything useful, I'll find out soon enough." As the men led her to a corner of the warehouse, Clara's eyes darted around, cataloging every detail. The layout, the exits, the men's movements. Every piece of information might become vital. She didn't know how yet, but she would use it. For now, survival meant staying unnoticed. Clara leaned against the cold, damp wall of the cell, her fingers tracing the rough stone as if seeking comfort in its solidness. The room was dimly lit by a flickering bulb that hummed like an uneasy conscience. She had counted the hours since her arrest, but time seemed to dissolve into the oppressive silence of captivity. Her mind, however, refused to be still. At first, the voices outside her cell were distant murmurs, indistinguishable from the echoes of footsteps on the tiled floors. But as her senses adjusted to the stillness, she began to discern words, fragments of conversations that drifted through the cracks in the heavy steel door. "She's dangerous," one voice grumbled, its tone gruff and laden with irritation. "If she talks, we're all screwed." "Relax," another replied, lower and more calculated. "No one's going to believe her. We've got the judge, the mayor, and half the council in our pocket. She's just a pawn." Clara's breath caught. Her suspicions about the depth of the corruption had been confirmed, and then some. The tangled web she had glimpsed before her arrest now seemed far larger and more intricate than she had imagined, involving figures she had once thought untouchable. A chill ran down her spine, but beneath it flickered a spark of determination. She pressed her ear closer to the door, straining to catch every word. The guards weren't particularly discreet, their arrogance making them careless. "The contract with Vallejo went through last week. Big payout," one of them said. "Yeah, but if anyone finds out how we're funneling the money..." "They won't," the other interrupted sharply. "That's what the accidents are for. People keep quiet when they know what's good for them." Clara's stomach churned, but her mind was already racing. Vallejo, accidents, money laundering. These weren't just random threads. They were pieces of a puzzle. She closed her eyes and visualized a map, each fragment of conversation lighting up like a point on a grid. If she could connect them, maybe she could expose the entire network. But how? She was locked away, watched by men who would undoubtedly kill to protect their secrets. She would have to be smart, use their arrogance and overconfidence against them. They thought she was helpless, a lone journalist with no one to back her up. That illusion was her only weapon for now. The hum of voices faded, replaced by the distant clatter of keys. Clara shifted back to her corner, feigning detachment. Her thoughts, however, were relentless. Every word she had heard replayed in her mind, each one a potential key to her escape, not just from the cell, but from the stranglehold of corruption choking her city. She opened her eyes and stared at the light bulb above. Its flicker mirrored in her own determination. She wasn't done yet. Clara's breath was shallow, her wrists raw from the tight ropes binding her hands behind her back. The dim light from the single overhead bulb flickered, casting eerie shadows on the cold, damp walls of the room. Her captors had left hours ago, the silence pressing on her ears like a weight. The door creaked open, and she tensed, bracing for another round of intimidation. Instead, it was Diego. He moved quickly, shutting the door behind him and crouching in front of her. His usual mask of indifference was gone, replaced by urgency. "Clara," he whispered, his voice low and hurried. "We don't have much time. I'm not who you think I am." She narrowed her eyes. "What is that supposed to mean?" "I'm an undercover agent," he said, glancing nervously at the door. "I've been working to dismantle Miguel's operation from the inside." Clara's laugh was dry, bitter. "Do you really expect me to believe that? After everything you've done?" Diego's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I had to play my part to stay alive, to gain their trust. Look, I can prove it." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small ID card. The official seal of the federal agency gleamed faintly in the weak light. She stared at the card, then at him, her mind racing. "This could be fake." "It's not," he said firmly. "And if you want to get out of here alive and take Miguel down, you'll have to trust me." Clara's skepticism didn't waver. "Why reveal yourself now? What's changed?" Diego hesitated, his gaze dropping for a moment. "Because Miguel suspects me. I overheard him talking about cleaning house. If he finds out for sure, we're both dead. But together, we might stand a chance." The tension in the room was palpable. Clara studied him, her instincts warring with her logic. Diego had been complicit in her capture, standing by as she was dragged into this nightmare. Yet there was something in his eyes, an intensity, a desperation that hinted at sincerity. "If you're lying to me," she said slowly, her voice cold as steel, "I'll make sure you regret it." Diego smirked faintly, a flicker of his usual bravado. "Fair enough, but I'm not lying." He pulled out a small blade and with a quick motion sliced through the ropes binding her hands. Clara rubbed her wrists, the freedom feeling both foreign and exhilarating. She stood, her legs stiff and shaky, and took a step back, still wary. "What's your plan?" she asked, her tone sharp. Diego glanced at the door again, lowering his voice. "Miguel's operation runs on fear and secrecy. If we expose him, his power crumbles. I have intel on his supply routes and contacts, but I need your help to take it further." "My help?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "What can I possibly do?" "You're resourceful and you're already in this," Diego replied. "We can't do it from the outside. We have to dismantle this from within." She crossed her arms, her mind racing. The idea of working with Diego was almost as repellent as the thought of staying in Miguel's clutches. But he was offering something no one else had so far, a glimmer of hope. "Fine," she said after a long pause, "but make no mistake, I'm not doing this for you. I want Miguel gone." Diego nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Good. We need to move fast. I'll create a distraction during the next shift change. That's when we'll make our move." Clara's heart pounded as she processed his words. For the first time since her capture, she felt a spark of control returning. But the road ahead was uncertain, and the man standing in front of her was far from trustworthy. Still, she had no other choice. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, stepping closer to him. "If you betray me, I'll make sure Miguel is the least of your problems." Diego met her gaze, unwavering. "Understood." As footsteps echoed down the corridor, they both froze. The fragile alliance had been forged, but the fight for survival was only beginning. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the hidden microphone beneath her blouse. The weight of her role felt heavier than ever, but her resolve was firm. Across the dimly lit room, Diego studied a hastily drawn map of Miguel's operations, his expression carved with determination. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low but steady. She nodded, brushing her dark hair away from her face. "It's the only way. If we don't act now, they'll tighten their grip, and we'll lose our chance." The plan was simple in theory, but perilous in execution. Clara would play the part of the cooperative insider, feeding false information to the kidnappers while Diego used his undercover identity to infiltrate the heart of Miguel's operation. Together, they hoped to uncover key details that could dismantle the network from within. Clara inhaled deeply, rehearsing her words as she approached the rusted metal door leading to the captor's makeshift headquarters. The air inside was suffocating, filled with the acrid scent of sweat and cigarettes. 3 men sat around a battered table, their conversations halting as Clara entered. "You wanted information about Diego?" she began, her tone laced with feigned reluctance. She clutched a piece of paper in her hand, shaking just enough to appear convincingly nervous. One of the men, a wiry figure with a scar stretching from his ear to his jawline, snatched the paper and scanned it. His eyes narrowed. "You got this from him?" Clara nodded quickly. "He doesn't suspect a thing. I've been careful." Meanwhile, Diego stood in the shadows of Miguel's warehouse, the buzz of machinery masking his movements. Dressed as one of Miguel's trusted couriers, he moved with practiced ease, careful not to draw attention. His eyes darted to the clipboard in his hand, where a list of deliveries pointed to a crucial drop-off site, an old shipping yard. The information he'd just gathered was gold, but he needed more. As Diego prepared to blend back into the chaos of the operation, a voice barked behind him. "You! Stop!" His muscles tensed, but he turned slowly, keeping his face impassive. A burly man with a clipboard of his own strode toward him, suspicion etched into his features. "What's your ID number?" the man demanded. Diego's heart thudded, but he quickly recited a number from memory, one he'd overheard earlier in the day. The burly man grunted and waved him off, but Diego didn't relax until he was out of sight. Back at the kidnapper's base, Clara faced her own challenge. The scarred man leaned closer, his eyes probing. "If you're lying, you won't like the consequences." Clara swallowed hard, but held her ground. "I'm risking my neck just talking to you," she shot back. "If you don't trust me, find someone else to help." The man smirked, finally backing down, but his gaze lingered on her longer than she liked. That night, Clara and Diego met in the cramped back room of an old mechanic's shop. Clara paced as Diego spread out his findings on the table. "They're moving something big to the shipping yard in 2 days," he explained, his voice urgent. "It's our chance to strike." Clara frowned, worry clouding her features. "They're starting to doubt me. One wrong move, and this whole thing falls apart." Diego stepped closer, his hand brushing hers briefly. "We can't afford to stop now, trust me." Clara nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. Their alliance was fragile, built on shared desperation and a single goal: to bring Miguel's empire crashing down. Laura Sanchez parked her battered sedan on the edge of the gravel lot, her eyes scanning the horizon as dusk settled over the small town. The air was heavy, laden with the smell of impending rain. She gripped her notebook tightly, the pages filled with scribbled names and timelines that refused to add up. Clara's disappearance had drawn her here, but now the puzzle seemed far larger than a single missing girl. Inside the car, she adjusted her voice recorder. "Clara Mendez, age 17, missing for 4 weeks. Authorities uncooperative. Leads point to systematic failures. Possible corruption. Next steps: explore connections to Judge Sofia Mendez and local law enforcement." The click of the recorder stopped as her phone buzzed. Renato's name flashed on the screen. "Renato," she answered briskly, tucking the phone between her shoulder and ear while rifling through her bag. "Anything new?" "Just more dead ends," came Renato's tired voice. "No one's talking, Laura. People here are terrified, and the cops, they're either clueless or complicit, maybe both." She frowned, jotting a note. Renato had been her first ally, a concerned brother desperate for answers and willing to challenge anyone standing in his way. "Meet me at Café do Sol in 10 minutes, Laura instructed. "We need to regroup." The cafe was dimly lit, its tables mostly empty except for a few locals hunched over coffee cups. Renato was already there, his expression taut. He slid a folder across the table. I've been looking into Clara's last known movements. This is what I have so far. Laura opened it, her eyes scanning photographs and transcripts of text messages. One image caught her attention. Clara exiting a library, her face tense. She looks afraid, Laura murmured, tracing the edges of the photo. This wasn't a random disappearance. Someone knew her schedule. Renato leaned forward. And someone wanted her gone. The deeper I dig, the clearer it gets. This town isn't safe for people like Clara or anyone asking questions. Laura's mind raced. She had dealt with corrupt officials before, but the sheer silence surrounding Clara's case was deafening. Police reports were missing key details, and witnesses who initially agreed to speak had gone silent overnight. She tapped her pen against her notebook. Renato, if we can't rely on the police, we need another angle. Who else knew Clara well? Friends? Teachers? Her best friend Sophia left town right after Clara vanished, Renato replied. No one's heard from her since. Laura's pen stilled. That's not a coincidence. The waiter interrupted briefly, placing steaming mugs of coffee in front of them. Renato took a long sip, his hands shaking slightly. Laura, I need to know, he said, voice low. Do you think we'll find her? Laura hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing. If we don't, it won't be because we didn't try. Renato's phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen. It's an anonymous text, he muttered, showing Laura. Stop digging or you'll regret it. Her heart skipped. They're watching us, she whispered. Renato's jaw tightened. What do we do now? Laura closed the folder and stood, her voice steady. We keep going, but we don't trust anyone, not here. If we're going to get answers, we'll have to find them ourselves. As they exited the cafe, the sky opened, rain pouring down in relentless sheets. Laura pulled her coat tighter, her determination hardening. Somewhere out there was the truth about Clara, and no matter how many walls they had to break through, Laura was prepared to tear them down. Renato paced the dimly lit room, the flickering light of a single bulb casting restless shadows on the walls. His sister's voice from the last phone call echoed in his mind, filled with fear and uncertainty. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to act. Sitting still, waiting, felt like a betrayal of his promise to protect her. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he muttered under his breath, I can't just sit here. The plan was clear. Clara and Diego had spent weeks strategizing every detail. Renato had promised to follow their lead. But tonight, doubt clouded his judgment. What if they were too late? What if his sister needed him now? His pulse quickened as he grabbed his jacket, ignoring the muffled voices from the adjoining room. He was halfway to the door when Diego's sharp tone halted him. Where do you think you're going? Diego's silhouette emerged from the doorway, his piercing gaze locking onto Renato. Clara was close behind, her expression a mix of confusion and frustration. I can't wait anymore, Renato shot back, his voice trembling with urgency. She's out there, and we're just sitting here. You think we don't know that? Clara's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She stepped forward, her usually calm demeanor replaced by an edge of anger. This isn't about you, Renato. If you act now, you'll ruin everything we've worked for, and worse, you'll put her in more danger. Diego crossed his arms, his voice low and steady. You think running in blind will help her? They'll see you coming from a mile away. Renato faltered, the weight of their words sinking in. His gaze dropped to the floor as guilt gnawed at him. He hadn't meant to jeopardize their efforts, but his heart was louder than his head. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I can't lose her. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, her tone softening. None of us can. That's why we have to stick to the plan. Together. Renato nodded, the fire in his chest tempered by their unwavering resolve. He took a deep breath, vowing silently to trust them, even if it meant swallowing his instinct to act. I'll cooperate, he said firmly, meeting their eyes. No more impulsive moves. I promise. Clara exchanged a glance with Diego, her expression unreadable, but she nodded. Good. Let's make sure this works. As the tension ebbed, Renato felt a flicker of hope reignite. For his sister, he would find the strength to wait. Clara's fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the polished mahogany table in Miguel's office, her expression carefully calculated, a mix of concern and intrigue. She leaned forward, her voice soft but laced with urgency. I overheard something, she began, her eyes darting as if weighing her own words. "There's a rumor that someone on your team might be unreliable." Miguel stiffened, the subtle tension in his jaw betraying his otherwise calm demeanor. "Unreliable?" he repeated, his voice a dangerous edge. Clara nodded, her gaze locking with his. "I'm not saying it's true, but if there's even a chance, you need to act before it spirals out of control. Perhaps it's time to gather everyone, clear the air, and see who flinches." The idea settled into Miguel's mind like a drop of ink in water, spreading with calculated precision. Clara knew how to plant seeds of doubt, and she watched with satisfaction as Miguel's thoughts began to churn. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit cafe across town, Diego hunched over a laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The screen glowed with incriminating evidence, detailed records of financial transactions, shipments, and covert meetings. Each click unearthed more proof of Miguel's sprawling criminal network. Diego leaned back, exhaling sharply. "We have everything we need," he murmured to himself, transferring the files onto a secure drive. Moments later, Diego joined Laura and Renato in a discreet rendezvous at an abandoned warehouse. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of their findings pressing down on them like a physical force. "This," Diego said, sliding the drive across the table to Renato, "is the nail in Miguel's coffin. Transactions, aliases, meeting locations, everything. He can't escape this." Laura inspected the drive, her brow furrowed. "We can't act too soon. If he suspects anything, he'll disappear. We need him cornered." Renato nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "Then we wait for the right moment. Let him believe he's still in control." Back at Miguel's headquarters, Clara's suggestion had already taken root. That evening, he summoned his inner circle, an ominous message sent to his closest confidants. The meeting was set for midnight in an underground location only they knew. As Miguel paced in his office, Clara observed him from the corner of her eye, her heart pounding despite her composed exterior. She had done her part, and now everything hinged on Diego's timing and the weight of the evidence he'd uncovered. The air seemed charged with anticipation, each piece of the puzzle inching closer to its fateful alignment. The meeting was set for a desolate industrial space at the edge of the city, a place chosen for its isolation. Laura had insisted on broadcasting the entire event live, despite Diego's concerns. "People need to see the truth," she argued, clutching her equipment as they loaded into the van. Clara, though apprehensive, supported the idea. It was a chance to expose Miguel and his web of corruption, once and for all. As night fell, shadows consumed the warehouse. The flickering glow of a single overhead light cast ominous patterns across the walls. Laura positioned herself discreetly in a corner, her camera hidden but perfectly aligned to capture every detail. Miguel arrived, flanked by his men, their expressions grim and calculating. The air seemed thick with tension, every sound amplified. The scrape of shoes on concrete, the faint hum of Laura's equipment. Miguel's voice broke the silence. "I hope you brought what I asked for," he said, his tone laced with veiled threats. His piercing gaze swept the room, landing on Diego, who stood protectively in front of Clara. Diego, never one to shy away from danger, stepped forward. "We're here to talk, Miguel. You don't need to involve anyone else in your schemes. Let's settle this." Miguel smirked, his confidence unnerving. "Settle this? Do you think I came here for negotiations?" He gestured, and one of his men stepped forward, revealing a knife glinting under the dim light. "No, Diego. Tonight, I'm taking back control." Unbeknownst to Miguel, Laura's broadcast was already live. Thousands of viewers watched as the confrontation escalated, their comments flooding in with outrage and disbelief. The exposure Miguel so desperately avoided was unfolding in real time, but he was still unaware. Clara's hands trembled as she tried to maintain her composure. She glanced at Laura, silently urging her to stay hidden. But then, something unexpected happened. One of Miguel's closest allies, Salazar, turned his weapon toward the group, his loyalty wavering. "I'm tired of being part of this," Salazar muttered, his voice heavy with regret. His defection was sudden and dangerous, catching everyone off guard. Miguel's eyes narrowed in fury. "Traitor!" he spat, lunging at Salazar with predatory speed. The chaos that followed was instant. Guns were drawn and the warehouse echoed with the sharp sound of gunfire. Diego grabbed Clara and pushed her toward cover, shielding her from the fray. His instincts took over as he scanned for an opening to neutralize Miguel. In the corner, Laura frantically adjusted her camera, ensuring every second of the pandemonium was captured. Her fingers trembled as she typed messages to the viewers, urging them to share the stream widely. Meanwhile, Miguel cornered Salazar, his rage boiling over. "You think you can betray me and walk away alive?" he hissed. Just as he raised his weapon, Diego intervened, tackling Miguel to the ground. The two men grappled fiercely, their movements a blur of raw power and desperation. Clara peeked from her hiding spot, her heart pounding as she watched Diego fight. She wanted to help but knew she'd only make things worse. Her fear turned to horror when one of Miguel's men spotted her and began advancing. "Stay away!" she screamed, backing into a wall. The man sneered, raising his weapon. A deafening shot rang out. Clara froze, bracing for pain, but it never came. She opened her eyes to see Salazar standing behind the attacker, his gun still smoking. He nodded at her briefly before turning to rejoin the chaos. The tide seemed to shift as Miguel's men began retreating, realizing their leader might not win this battle. Laura, despite her fear, stepped out of her hiding spot to shout, "It's over, Miguel! The world is watching!" Miguel froze, his eyes darting to Laura and the camera she held. For the first time, fear flashed across his face. Diego, bloodied but unbroken, rose to his feet. "Surrender, Miguel, it's over." But Miguel wasn't done. A final, desperate move was brewing, and everyone in the room could feel it. The air was heavy with tension as Clara scanned the dimly lit room. The table before her was cluttered with scattered documents, maps, and hastily scribbled notes. The faint hum of a distant generator filled the silence, an omnipresent reminder of the fragile stability they clung to. Clara's fingers traced over the edge of a photograph. Miguel's face stared back, cold and unrepentant. "Everything is set," murmured Javier, his voice low but steady. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression hardened by years of betrayal and loss. "If this plan fails, there won't be another chance." Clara nodded, her eyes never leaving the photograph. "We have to make sure it doesn't fail," she replied. Her voice carried the weight of her resolve, but beneath the surface, doubt gnawed at her. Every move they made felt like playing a desperate game against time, with Miguel always one step ahead. Javier stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We've done all we can. The message was sent. Now we wait." The message, a carefully encrypted alert, had been their only hope to draw outside help. The thought that someone might not respond, that they might be left alone to face Miguel's powerful network, sent a shiver down her spine. Clara pushed the fear aside and focused on the task at hand. "We'll need to move by dawn," she said, gathering the papers. "If they're coming, they'll meet us at the checkpoint. If not," her voice trailed off, the unspoken truth lingering in the air. Javier didn't need her to finish the sentence. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the weight of uncertainty. Clara steeled herself. The night would be long, but she knew the battle was far from over. The story of Clara reminds us that justice is rarely straightforward, and the fight for what's right often comes with painful sacrifices. It challenges us to question how far we would go to stand up against corruption and defend our values. Would you have the courage to confront a broken system, even when the cost feels overwhelming? Clara's journey shows that even the smallest victory can ignite a larger change, but only if we're willing to persist. Click on the video on your screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and explore what it truly means to fight for your beliefs. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories and lessons that challenge your perspective. Together, let's keep reflecting and growing.